Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Practical Shaman podcast. It's been a little while since I've been here. I tend to interview authors. I have the weekly The Shaman's Cave with Sandra Ingerman, but we don't interview people. We have these great conversations back and forth between ourselves, and we laugh a lot. But it's really nice when I get to talk to other people. And today, there's somebody that I've been watching on the sidelines for many, many years. And we took some of the same training, but I don't think that our paths really ever crossed until today. And with me, I have Carl Greer, PhD, PsyD, is a retired clinical psychologist and Jungian analyst, a businessman and a shamanic practitioner, author and philanthropist, funding over 60 charities and more than 850 past and current Greer Scholars. He is taught at this Young Institute in Chicago, where he has been on staff at the Replodge Center for Counseling and Well-Being. And you're very well respected. And here's his new book, the Necktie and The Jaguar. It's kind of funny because I think the last person that I interviewed also had the necktie or something in the Jaguar. It was somebody else who had been a businessman. And so that's kind of interesting that businessmen, for me, they look at it as a jaguar, like taming some jaguar. So how is it that you relate the jaguar to business in this country?
I grew up in the Midwest, Renee, and kind of traditional Midwestern background, and thought that my destiny was going to be a businessman. And I was for a while. I did other things. I wore a necktie, literally. And part of me wanted to do something else with my life, didn't know what that was. And that got represented for me by Jaguar energy, which I ran into as I started to do shamanic work. So I had the juxtaposition of those two worlds. And that's why I titled the book the way I did.
It's interesting. So many of us wanted to be business people. Like an early vision that I had was that I could be a business person all I wanted, but if somebody asked for the healing, I needed to put the camera down or, the marketing material down or something like that. So how did that reveal itself to you? I mean, what a change of life to go from being a gas station executive to a psychoanalyst, a Jungian analyst at that. I guess that going down deep into the gas wells could really bring that out. And then finding your way into a shamanic path.
As a young man, I felt that it would not serve me to be involved in daydreaming or liberal arts or mythopoetic, what I called it, activity. So I wanted to burn that out of my system. And I tried to do that by taking metallurgical engineering in college and then being in business. But I had this part of me that was not really being satisfied. And eventually in my mid-40s, I said, I'm going to try to satisfy that, still keeping my business hat on. But then I became a psychologist, a Jungian analyst. And then at age 60, I followed a call that I'd had most of my life to explore shamanism. And that was kind of my spiritual home and calling since then. And not 20 some years later, I'm glad that I've done that. So I've had a variety of experiences. And now I feel I've fed that part of myself the way it hadn't been fed for many years.
And so what are you going to feed the next 20 years with?
Well, having survived open heart surgery not so long ago and cancer therapy, I would be happy to have a little less in that. But shooting for that, I'm really involved at this stage in my life, Renee, in trying to give back to people that have had maybe a tough break in life. So I've helped a lot of young people from bad neighborhoods get educated in STEM programs so they can make good money. I work with a lot of battered women's groups. I work with homeless groups, vets who come back with PTSD. And for many years, I had my own healing practice, both as a Jungian and as a shamanic healer. So those are all the areas that interest me.
Did you combine the two, or did I know, like, I work for a behavioral health company, and when I used to bring my wind work, for those of you who don't know, I wrote the book Winds of Spirit, and I would take my wind whistle into the treatment program over at the addiction, and my boss would say, Renee, this is not evidence-based. And yet I'd blow the wind whistle and 75 patients would gather around for a ceremony. And I'm there like, well, maybe we need some evidence. So did you keep those two paths separate, or did you combine them into a single practice, or how'd you dance those worlds?
Well, I had, first I was a licensed clinical psychologist. And that's what I did for many years. And that was pretty straight clinical psychology. When I became an analyst, I did analytical work. But again, you're working with unconscious, unseen energy, somewhat similar to what we do as a shaman. Then I had my shamanic practice. All of these were somewhat different. Now, the Jungian work and the clinical psychology could be combined. I had a very few number of people I worked with that I did both, the Jungian work and the shamanic work. But for the most part, they were separate practices, but not always.
Mm. One time I was working with somebody who was pretty severely bipolar, and I did a little visualization journeys with her, and the psychiatrist absolutely tossed a tantrum on the whole idea. And it was really unfortunate because there was ways that she was making progress there, but we forget, like when I would go into the treatment center and shake the rattle, somebody with a bipolar or a schizoaffective, they really would respond, like really, it could trigger them. So, not one for all, but you certainly have a great combination, which is really why I was enjoying going through, especially your exercises and your stories, because so often, people see people who want to be spiritual, but life is, everything about life to me is spiritual. Mm-hmm. From understanding yourself, working in a gas station, to taking your children fishing. And I think that you've done a really brilliant job of weaving that together. And tell us about your story here. Why the memoir? Why now?
Well, thank you for what you said. I started off writing this over the last few years, basically for my kids and grandkids, and just some reflections on my life. And as I got more into it, I thought, well, maybe I'll include some friends. I'd written a couple of other books where my emphasis was, how do you bring your spirituality into your everyday life? It's kind of like take your yoga off the mat, and bring it into life. And so I wrote the book for my kids and family and friends. And then I thought, there's some themes in there that affected my life that maybe apply to other people. So at the end of each chapter, I'll, pose some questions to the reader, those who want to spend any time doing that, and they can just think about their own life too. And that's how it came about.
It's funny. I used to teach at the Bhakti Fest when I was, exploring the wind work, and I always would say, yeah, they have me here. I'm the off the mat yoga person. That this is about, like, one of the things that I noticed in that yoga movement was everyone was doing poses and still living out of integrity. And so it seems like in your life you had several pivotal moments where you really had to look at your own integrity and look at your own hard decisions and make other choices for yourself. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I didn't have any big epiphany or aha moment. I had little stirrings and yearnings inside of me that had not been met. And I made a lot of changes at the margin that eventually led into bigger changes. Unlike some who burned all their bridges, I kept a lot of my bridges kind of intact. So I still had a business practice. I still had a psychology practice. I still had a philanthropic practice. I still spent time with my kids and grandkids. But I kind of changed my emphasis, and I did it with, I think, a little bit more grace and elegance as I got more. I was a little less cross and impatient, and not the person that I wanted to be. And I've evolved. I've done some work on myself in this whole process to change, and so it's all been part of a bigger whole.
I've always thought people who go into psychology and get those psychology degrees, it's, that unfinished part of themselves. And when you went from, businessman, were you hoping to help other business people explore deeper parts of themselves, or what was your personal goal at the time?
I would say the stated goal was to help and be of service, but maybe the unconscious goal was to heal myself, kind of work on myself, and as to what would be the group of people that I would be working with. I didn't know that at the time. It turned out that I ended up working for a fair amount of time in kind of really tough neighborhoods, bad neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, with people who didn't have access to a lot of private health care and who had pretty severe mental illnesses. So it turned out that got me really thinking about the needs of a whole lot of people, most of whom I didn't grow up with. And that's kind of colored the charities that I've been involved with ever since that. So it just kind of evolved as to the kinds of people that I worked with and the kind of work that I've done.
It's kind of interesting because, a lot of times we move towards those circles of, when I was doing shamanic healing, it was like I had millions of experiences in my life, and it seemed like everybody who came along kind of fit into those grooves. And then as a point, and this might be a healing place, but then as a pivotal moment when we really become of service, the work that we expect that we're going to do and the work that we're doing is a whole other ball game. Did you find that to be true definitely with that element that you worked with psychology wise?
I did. And where it was kind of interesting to me, as I did the shamanic work and I did deeper Jungian work, I became more and more aware that oftentimes the less that I did got out of the way, but to hold space and invite in. And that sounds kind of a little hard for people to understand, but to somehow be congruent myself with these bigger energies, these unseen energies, and then let those energies and whoever I'm working with, my client, interact. And I'm just holding space for it and maybe being guided as to what to say or what to do, but feeling less responsible to fixing the client or to do it. That was a good part of my growth and my learning, to let that happen. And as you could probably appreciate, good things can come from that way of doing things.
Way better than you can even imagine. It's like always this or something better. So you wrote this for your children and your grandchildren, and now where are you hoping it goes?
Well, in my other two books, I kind of hope it goes to those who can benefit from it. And that sounds pretty general, but I believe that we are part of a larger picture, a lot of energies and things kind of, God helps those who help themselves. But I think my other books have been in the hands of people who, that it's useful that they're there. And I hope this book gets there too. And it can be my other audiences, which would be shamans, Jungians, psychologists, but also anybody who's thinking about making changes in their life. On the surface, they've got, seemingly good marriages, and they lots of, nice, kids, and make a lot of money and take a lot of vacations, but they're miserable. And so I'm just trying to say it's never too late to look at yourself and make changes at the margin that can make you feel a little bit better in this lifetime than you otherwise would. And that requires, in my opinion, you got to connect to these other realms. I'm sure you have worked with people who have had resolutions. I'm going to do this different. I'm going to do that differently. And but they never can. So part of themselves wants to do something different, but I believe there's another part that doesn't. And if you can get in touch with that part that doesn't through Jungian work, shamanic work, and get energy and information from that inquiry, that can help you make changes that heretofore you've not been able to make. So that's kind of what I'm about in the books that I've written. That's what my goal was. And this book is just another, using some of my experiences as examples. Hopefully it'll get a few people, or hopefully more than that, to think about their lives and reflect on them and maybe make changes that they otherwise wouldn't have made.
It brings me to an interesting thought that recently I've noticed that a lot of people with a lot of mental health disorders have been being more and more attracted to shamanic teachers and shamanic groups and things like that. So how do you suggest that people know the difference between when you need the Jungian psychologist and when you need a journey to the underworld? Is there a distinction that you found over the years that's really helpful for determining, okay, this, I'm going to put my psychology hat on, I'm going to put my shaman hat on?
I think in both cases, you're trying to have the ego consciousness that thinks it knows everything get exposed to another source of energy. And be it a Jungian, might call it the personal unconscious or the collective unconscious. And a shaman may say it's the transpersonal realms, including nature. I think they're similar. I kind of relate in some ways to the way I think about it shamanically, because it's got a certain aliveness to it. But certainly the collective unconscious in Jungian's work in is very similar. And if you start back from your creation myth, if you try to ask, how did it all come about? Where do we come from? My own personal experiences in that realm have been, having been to this place, I call it the quiet, the place before creation, before the Big Bang, that has just pure potential. There's no idea there. There's no form of the idea. There's no energization of the idea. And from this place of potential, we are here now talking, you and I. And shamans believe, as you all know, that we still coexist with this place of pure potential every moment. And it's possible for us to interact with that and cause things to happen in this reality that you and I are in right now that otherwise wouldn't had we not interacted with it. How you interact with it is kind of sort of interesting thing. Different people have different ways of connecting to it. You mentioned, shamanic journey or active imagination in Jungian work, or dialoguing, or conversing with, or spending time in nature, and starting to understand that nature is observing us just like we're observing her, and then having a relationship with those observations. So I think as you change the way in which you think about your life and work with your life, then things become richer. And, to your question, at that point, the oneness between Jungians and, shamans it disappears.
Yeah, I remember once a friend of mine in Mexico telling me that in her village, if there was somebody who was having, a manic episode and they took off all their clothes and jumped into the fountain in the mainstream, somebody would come there, wrap them with a blanket and take them home. And in our more Western ideas, we wrap them in an ambulance and cart them off for, 5150. And so I do believe that we're coming to that place of intersection. I know it's not in your book, and this really is a really interesting book, especially for you. And I'm going to share this on my main wall too, because what I do really like about there is people don't read so much anymore, and so if you look for the little gray sections, you get a good summation about, wow, was that chapter even good for me? And, what is he looking at and what's he talking about, and exercises. And then you can backpedal into the chapter as, it's kind of like a backing in approach to at work, because we're not always ready to dive deep. And you know what? It's not always appropriate to dive deep. Where was I going with that thought? I think that I lost my brain here for a minute. And I think that it's a really good book that everyone should pick up. Oh, I know where I was going. What do you think? The newest thing is I was just looking over at Harvard, and I'm putting on a behavioral health conference in 2022, and now everything is the mushrooms, the psilocybins, the plant medicines. So there was a place in your book that I was wondering if you were alluding to, that you drank some medicine here, and that expanded that journey that you had with the rock, or if that was just your first experience holding a black rock. I wasn't, like the jaguar stone. So what do you think of all the plant medicines being interwoven into psychology at this moment?
Well, I've for partaken of plant medicines for a lot of years and had very profound experiences with them. And so I think it can be a way to have a person get in touch with these realms that I was mentioning, this place before creation, and various manifestations, seen and unseen, from that. But I've also believe, again, through personal experiences, you can access a lot of those places without the plants. And the plants in the wrong hands could be not good. The leaders of a group, if they're not really able to hold the space and understand all the energies that they're going to be coming up with, it can really be dangerous, not only for them, but for the people involved, in my opinion. And to a question you were saying earlier, what do you do with a manic person or a bipolar person that has upsurges from the unconscious that overcome them? You have to be very, very careful, in my opinion, to not enable those things to come up without some ways to control them. And in psychology, and I would say good shamans that I know, they realize you have to have a pretty strong ego to confront all these images that are so other that could come up with plants or from a journey. And so there's this titration of how much do you want to let come in? And some people, once it comes in, they get flooded and they can't really get back out of it. Or there's some people that are so tight that they never let anything come in from this side, and then they lose the richness of it. So it's a real balancing act, but I think you have to be very, very careful if you've got some diagnoses as to when you do the plants, under what circumstances. Having said that, I know some things like depression, people have had great, results from. People who are close to dying, they become much more at peace sometimes having a LSD, mushroom, or ayahuasca experience. So I would say, in my opinion, there's a place for that, but you have to be not casual about it and be pretty intentional about how you do it.
And I absolutely agree. In fact, one of the conversations that I want to have at the conference is with somebody like you, a shaman with a clinical background, a psychiatrist, and, to really have that conversation, like, can you take the ritual out of the medications that we're now introducing to people? Or, is it even possible? And I thought, oh, maybe he'd be great for this conference. So we'll have to stay in touch with this. What else? Give us like one final thought that you'd like people to really know about your book, why they would pick it up, who they would buy a copy for. Like, you said people going through changes, but you feel like it's written for more men, for women, or how? I mean,
I hope it resonates with. I mean, I'm a guy, so a guy wrote it, but I hope women can relate to themes, because I talk about my relationship to my parents and my sibling and my kids, and so a lot of us can relate to those kinds of things. With a job, with competition, with being a leader versus a follower, with kind of personal traits. How impatient are we? How much are we cranky? How much are we demanding of others? How much do we sacrifice ourselves? So there's a lot of themes that I think go to men and women, and I think old and young. So I don't think there's a particular audience out there that I can think of. And some of the people that have gotten it already and commented to me about it, they go across all those age groups and men and women in all kind of different occupations.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Just a short word or two about your earlier book about changing your story to change your life,
Yes.
and then you have a workbook that goes with it as well.
Well, I don't have a workbook that goes with it. I have another book called Change the Story of Your Health. Because after my first book, I got a lot of kind of inquiries about people that had health issues and what can we do, shamanically and Jungian to kind of address our health issues. And so I wrote a book about that. And but those two books were involved with this idea that we all live a life about what your story can be told. And sometimes that we inherit a story from our parents or our culture or our teachers, and to kind of become our own person, sometimes we need to be able to write our own story, and it's hard. So the starting point is what has been your story, and do you want to change it? And if you want to change it, why can't you? And then address those issues. And sometimes you say, well, it's just a question of will. I'll just make myself change it. And then that gets back to what we talked about earlier. I mean, there's a part of you that doesn't want to change, that you don't even recognize. And then can you get in touch with that and work with it so the change is possible? So that's what my first two books are about, both in health, they're about just in relationships, psychology, jobs, giving back, relationship to a higher power. We look at all those chapters in our lives and see, can we do it more elegantly in the time we have left than we've been doing it?
Absolutely. And what's your website so people could go over there and learn more about you?
CarlGreer.com.
And that's Greer for those looking for him. And leave us with one final thought. I hear, like, when you talk, I almost hear like no difference between Jungian psychology and shamanism. And, was Jung a shaman?
This gets all the definitional things. He certainly believed in working with the unseen worlds, as shamans do. Now, how he did it was similar. I mean, he would draw and he would sculpt and he would try to relate to them in right brain ways, not just always kind of with the left brain. And so in that sense, and he believed in the power of nature. He got transfigured on a beautiful sunset, or a mountain in Africa, or a cloud. So he appreciated the power of nature. He appreciated the power of the unseen worlds. He appreciated that it is possible to change. Not always easy, but it's possible. And we in spirit have to co-create that change.
Absolutely. And so I don't know if in the Jungian approach, when I was writing Winds of Spirits, I went up to that school up there in Pacifica. And I was thinking about taking the mythology, because really the wind was there at the creation, and Winds of Spirits all about, how to manifest energy into form through the wind, which has been here since the get-go. And, he assured me that he was going to take me 3 or 4 years off my journey of writing my book, although he would allowed it to have been my thesis. So I didn't go get that education. But I did spend 7 years writing the book, which is kind of goes back to the mythology of the stories that people kept that have long lived into our culture. But these wind gods and goddesses have really breathed the life into all of our mystery since the get-go. Your book is interesting. I wrote a memoir when I was first starting, which was really my story. First time it was about me, the next time it was about them, and the next time it was like nobody was to blame and it was all good. But one day you're inspiring me to go back and write my book. But so all of you listeners at home, I really recommend the Necktie and The Jaguar. And because I believe you have healed, and I believe that there's a softness here that only comes from when somebody's walked their walk and done their healing. and to be able to go back and look at, everything from the gas station attendant to, the family relationships that may or may not be working anymore, that takes a lot of courage. And to be able to come to the other side of it and still be philanthropic and work with people is really of high esteem. So on that, leave us with one final thought today.
One thing that I've learned and appreciated that I could just maybe talk about with readers, and that is become a good listener, to the things around you, to the people around you. Listen, then respond, and not try to fix people's issues. Don't try to analyze them. Just listen. Be a good listener. I call that sacred listening. And I would say if you can develop that practice, that can be a very important part in your spiritual quiver.
Awesome. And what chapter can we find that in here too on the sacred listening?
No, but I talk about it in my own life as a learning, which I wish I would have been better at that earlier.
Absolutely. I know. There's a hubbub in a group on Facebook right now because people are feeling unheard and not listened to, or thinking that they're, especially now we're in such a culture and time where that you're getting a text. How do you listen to a text and get any of the correct information out of it, or pick up the phone?
Well, you're, I think, a lot younger than I, but we come from a generation that phone calls are very powerful compared to a text.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Carl, for being here with us today. And go over to carlgreer.com and his first book. Really, a lot of people that I knew were really talking about it and doing workshops around it. And so there's a lot of information and a lot of good food for thought. So thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Renee. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed talking to you.